The candle went out first, and then the screaming began. Eleanor Ashworth did not scream. She stood in the dark corridor of Bramwell Hall, the tray of dessert plates still balanced in her hands, and listened to 200 guests panic around her because a single row of chandeliers had failed at once. Somewhere near the staircase, a woman shrieked that the house was on fire. It was not on fire. It was only dark, and people did not know the difference between the two when their eyes could not adjust fast enough. She set the tray down on the hall table by feel alone, having walked this corridor 1,000 times since childhood, and reached into the drawer where the household always kept spare candles and a tin of matches. Her fingers found them without hesitation. She struck a match, lit the wick, and the small flame pushed back the darkness, just enough for 3 frightened guests near her to stop shouting. "This way," she said, her voice calm and unremarkable, the way it always was. "The stairs are safe. Follow the light." No one thanked her by name, because most of them did not know her name. They knew her sister's name. Everyone in the county knew Camilla Ashworth's name, because Camilla was the kind of beautiful that stopped conversations, the kind that made mothers steer their sons across ballrooms, and made poets embarrassingly bad at their craft. Eleanor was the other one, the sister who managed the linens and the accounts and, apparently, the emergency lighting. She guided 6 people to the base of the staircase before someone finally restored the chandeliers, and when the light returned, she blew out her candle, picked her tray back up, and walked toward the kitchen as if nothing had happened. Nothing had happened, as far as she was concerned. It was simply what needed doing. She did not know that a stranger near the far wall, wearing an unremarkable gray coat that concealed exactly how important he was, had watched the entire scene from start to finish. Bramwell Hall belonged to Eleanor's family, though it did not feel like it belonged to her. The house had been built by her grandfather, a man who had made his money in shipping and then spent the rest of his life trying to make his family seem as though it had always been wealthy. Her father, Edmund Ashworth, had inherited both the house and the anxiety that came with maintaining it. Her mother, Margaret Ashworth, had inherited the conviction that her daughters' marriages were the only investment left worth making. There were 2 daughters to invest in, and only one of them, in Margaret's estimation, was worth the effort. "Camilla, stand up straight," her mother said, the following morning, adjusting the ribbon at her younger daughter's waist, while Camilla stood in front of the long mirror in the drawing room. "The Duke will be at the Whitfield dinner tonight. I want you glowing, not glancing at your feet." "I never glance at my feet," Camilla said, though not unkindly. She was, in fact, rarely unkind. She simply existed in a world where things came easily, and people who exist in such worlds sometimes forget how heavy the world is for everyone else. Eleanor sat in the corner of the room with the household ledger open on her lap, adding figures that did not want to add correctly. She was aware, without looking up, that she had not been asked to stand in front of any mirror. She had not expected to be. It had been years since anyone expected her to be looked at. "Eleanor," her mother said, not turning around, "have you finished with the linens for the Whitfield dinner? Lady Whitfield will notice if anything is wrinkled." "They are finished, mother." "Good girl." Good girl. Not beautiful girl, not clever girl, not even useful girl. Good girl. The way one might praise a well-trained animal. Eleanor closed the ledger with more force than necessary and told herself, as she had told herself many times before, that it did not matter. She had made her peace with her role in this family long ago. She managed things. Camilla was admired. Their father worried about money. Their mother worried about marriage. Everyone had a function, and Eleanor's function was simply less visible than her sister's. It did not mean it was less important. She reminded herself of that often, usually late at night when the house was quiet and she had time to think thoughts that were not strictly practical. The gentleman in the gray coat had a name, though very few people at Bramwell Hall had learned it correctly the night before. He was Nathaniel Hartley, the Duke of Ravensworth, and he had arrived in the county 3 weeks earlier, under the modest explanation that he was inspecting a property he had recently inherited from a distant relation. This explanation was true, but incomplete. The fuller truth was that Nathaniel had grown deeply tired of London, of ballrooms filled with young women who had rehearsed their laughter, of mothers who calculated his worth before he had finished removing his coat, and of the particular exhaustion that comes from being valued for a title rather than for anything a person actually does. He had come to the countryside partly for the property and partly to disappear for a season, to remember what ordinary conversation sounded like when it was not performed for his benefit. It had not entirely worked. Word traveled fast in small counties, and a duke, however quietly he tried to arrive, does not stay unnoticed for long. Within a week, every family with an unmarried daughter had found some reason to invite him to dinner, and within 2 weeks, Nathaniel had grown skilled at appearing pleasant while saying almost nothing true about himself. Bramwell Hall's ball had been his 4th such evening that month, and he had expected it to be indistinguishable from the other 3. He had expected the same introductions, the same daughters presented like items in a shop window, the same mothers hovering nearby to make sure their daughters said the correct things. He had not expected the chandeliers to fail, and he had not expected the plain-dressed young woman with the ledger-keeper's posture to be the only person in the room who did not lose her composure. He asked about her before he left that night, carefully, the way a man learns to ask questions without revealing why he is asking them. "The young woman who managed the candles," he said to his host, Lord Whitfield, as they stood near the entrance. "I did not catch her name." "Ah, that would be Eleanor," Lord Whitfield said, with the mild indifference of a man discussing furniture. "The elder Ashworth girl, quiet sort, runs the household, I believe, more than her mother does, truth be told. The younger one, Camilla, is the beauty of the family. You'll meet her properly at the Whitfield dinner, I expect. Half the county will be there hoping you notice her." Nathaniel had nodded and said nothing further, but he had remembered the name, Eleanor. The Whitfield dinner, held 2 evenings later, was exactly the sort of evening Nathaniel had grown accustomed to dreading. The dining room was arranged with careful attention to seating, which meant, of course, that he had been placed directly across from Camilla Ashworth, whose beauty was, he had to admit, within the privacy of his own thoughts, considerable. She had pale gold hair and eyes the color of a clear morning sky, and she smiled at him with the practiced ease of someone who had been told her entire life that smiling was one of her greatest assets. "Your Grace," she said, when the second course arrived, "I understand you have been inspecting Ashcombe Manor. It must be a great deal of work, restoring a property that has been neglected for so long." "It is considerable work," Nathaniel agreed, "though I find I do not mind it. There is something satisfying in repairing what has been left to fall apart." "How admirable," Camilla said, and her smile did not waver, though her eyes had already drifted, briefly, toward the door, as if checking who else had entered the room, and whether they had noticed her sitting across from a duke. Nathaniel noticed the drift. He noticed it because he had spent years learning to notice such things, the small signs of a person's true attention, and he found himself, without quite meaning to, glancing further down the table, past 3 empty chairs, to where Eleanor Ashworth sat quietly, beside an elderly aunt, cutting her meat with unhurried precision, and contributing to the conversation, only when asked a direct question. She was not unattractive. She simply did not seem to consider her own appearance a matter worth much thought, and in a room full of people who thought of little else, this made her strangely difficult to look away from. "Your sister does not speak much," Nathaniel said to Camilla, as gently as he could manage, hoping the question would not sound as pointed as it felt. "Eleanor?" Camilla glanced down the table, as if genuinely trying to remember her sister was present. "She is not much for company, I'm afraid. She prefers her ledgers and her lists to conversation. Mother says she was always the practical one, even as a child." "Practical," Nathaniel repeated. "That does not sound like a fault to me." Camilla laughed, a light, pleasant sound that several nearby guests turned to admire. "No, of course not. It is only that practical people rarely have much to say for themselves at dinner parties." Nathaniel said nothing further on the subject, but he found himself watching Eleanor for the remainder of the meal, not obviously, not in any way that would have drawn comment, but with the quiet attentiveness of a man who has begun to suspect that the most interesting person in a room is often the one everyone else has stopped looking at. After dinner, the guests moved to the drawing room, where a small group gathered around the pianoforte, and Camilla was asked, predictably, to play. She played well, though without any particular passion, the notes falling into place the way everything in her life seemed to fall into place, easily and without struggle. Eleanor slipped away from the gathering during the music, not out of rudeness, but because she had noticed one of the younger housemaids looking distressed near the hallway, and had gone to see what the trouble was. Nathaniel noticed her leaving. He waited a polite interval, long enough that his absence would not seem deliberate, and then followed. He found her in the narrow servants' corridor, kneeling beside a young girl of perhaps 14, who was crying quietly into her apron. "What happened?" Eleanor was asking, her voice low and steady. "I broke the good teapot, miss, the one from the cabinet. I was carrying it to be washed, and it slipped." The girl's words came out in a rush, thick with fear. "Is anyone hurt?" "No, miss." "Then it is only a teapot," Eleanor said, and there was such simple kindness in the way she said it, that Nathaniel, standing unseen at the edge of the corridor, felt something in his chest shift slightly out of place. "Teapots can be replaced. Fingers cannot. Go and wash your face, and I will explain to Lady Whitfield's housekeeper myself. No one will think less of you." The girl nodded, wiped her eyes, and hurried off, and Eleanor rose to her feet, smoothing her skirts, entirely unaware that she had been observed. "That was well done," Nathaniel said. Eleanor turned quickly, startled, and for the first time that evening, Nathaniel saw something other than composure cross her face, a flicker of surprise, followed almost immediately by a careful, guarded politeness, the expression of someone unused to being addressed directly by important people. "Your Grace," she dropped into a small, proper curtsy. "I did not realize anyone had followed me." "I did not mean to intrude," he said. "I was concerned for the girl. She will be well. It was only a teapot, as I said." Eleanor hesitated, then added, with the faintest trace of dry humor, "Though I understand it was a very expensive teapot, and Lady Whitfield's housekeeper is unlikely to share my opinion that fingers matter more than china." Nathaniel found himself smiling, an unguarded smile, the first genuine one he had produced all evening. "I will vouch for you, if it comes to that. A duke's word ought to be worth at least one broken teapot." "That is very generous of you, Your Grace, though I suspect Lady Whitfield's housekeeper answers to no duke but her own opinion of proper china care. Then I fear the girl is doomed after all." "I fear she is," Eleanor agreed, and for a moment, standing in the dim servants' corridor, with a duke she had never properly met, she allowed herself something she rarely allowed herself in the company of strangers, an honest, unguarded laugh. It was a small moment, over almost as soon as it began, and neither of them spoke of it again that evening. Eleanor returned to her duties, and Nathaniel returned to the drawing room, where Camilla was finishing her piece at the pianoforte, to warm applause, and looking, as she always looked, entirely certain of her place in the room. But Nathaniel, applauding along with the others, found his thoughts elsewhere. He was thinking of candles held steady in the dark, and of teapots that did not matter as much as fingers, and of a plain, practical young woman who had not once, in all the time he had watched her, tried to make him notice her. It was, he was beginning to realize, precisely why he could not stop. He left Whitfield House that night with no clearer sense of his future than when he had arrived, but with one new and unfamiliar certainty settling quietly into his thoughts, that the woman his hosts kept steering him away from was the only one, in 3 exhausting weeks of dinners and dances, who had made him feel like an ordinary man rather than a title to be won. He said nothing of this to anyone. He was, after all, a careful man, unused to trusting sudden feelings, and he told himself, as his carriage rolled back toward Ashcombe Manor through the dark countryside, that it was nothing more than curiosity. A duke was allowed to be curious about a household's quiet, capable daughter. It meant nothing beyond that. He almost believed it. Behind him, at Bramwell Hall, Eleanor climbed the stairs to her small room at the end of the family corridor, changed out of her good dinner dress, and sat for a while at her window, looking out at the dark garden below. She thought, briefly, of the Duke's smile in the servants' corridor, and then told herself firmly that it was nothing worth thinking about. Dukes did not marry practical daughters who managed linens and calmed frightened housemaids. Dukes married girls like Camilla, girls who glowed in candlelight and played the pianoforte with easy grace and never once had to think about broken teapots. She blew out her own candle and went to sleep, entirely unaware that, 3 miles away, a duke lay awake in an unfamiliar bedchamber, thinking of her. Ashcombe Manor had once been a grand house, though years of neglect had left its gardens overgrown, and its east wing closed off entirely due to a leaking roof that no one had bothered to repair. Nathaniel had inherited it from a great-uncle he had met only twice in his life, and he had come to the countryside telling himself that its restoration would be a useful distraction. What he had not expected was how much he would come to prefer its quiet, crumbling rooms to the polished ballrooms of London. He rose early the morning after the Whitfield dinner, before his valet had even laid out his clothes, and stood at the window of his study looking out over the unkempt lawn. Sleep had not come easily. He kept returning, against his own better judgment, to the image of Eleanor Ashworth, kneeling beside a frightened housemaid, speaking with a gentleness that asked for nothing in return. He told himself, as he had told himself the night before, that this was simple curiosity. A man notices kindness when he has spent years surrounded by its opposite. That was all. It did not need to mean anything further. By mid-morning, however, he had invented a reason to call at Bramwell Hall. "I understand your family manages a considerable stretch of tenant farms," he said to Edmund Ashworth, once he had been shown into the study, and the necessary pleasantries exchanged. "I find myself in need of advice regarding my own tenants at Ashcombe. The previous owner left the accounts in some disorder, and I am told your household keeps excellent records. It was not entirely a fabrication. Ashcombe's accounts were, in fact, a genuine disaster, and Nathaniel did need help sorting them. He had simply not mentioned, in his letter requesting the visit, that he had a particular member of the household in mind when he thought of whose help to request. Edmund Ashworth, delighted at the prospect of a duke seeking his family's assistance, could not have been more accommodating. "Of course, Your Grace, of course. Though I confess the day-to-day figures are handled by my elder daughter, Eleanor. She has a head for such things that I have never quite managed myself. Shall I have her join us?" "If it would not be an imposition," Nathaniel said, keeping his voice carefully even, "I would be glad of her assistance." Eleanor arrived a few minutes later, summoned by a servant, and stopped just inside the doorway when she saw who was waiting. She recovered quickly, offering a proper curtsy, though Nathaniel did not miss the brief widening of her eyes. "Your Grace, I did not expect to see you again so soon. I have brought a problem," he said, "and I am told you are the person most likely to solve it." Over the next hour, Eleanor reviewed the tangled ledgers Nathaniel had brought with him, and Nathaniel watched, genuinely fascinated, as she worked through years of confused entries with quiet, methodical patience. She asked precise questions. She noticed discrepancies that had escaped 3 different estate managers. She did not once perform for his benefit, did not once glance up to see if he was impressed by her, and this, more than anything, was what impressed him most. "Your previous steward was either careless or dishonest," she said finally, closing the last ledger. "These figures do not match what your tenants would reasonably owe. I would recommend a full review before you agree to anything he has proposed for the coming season." "You have just saved me a considerable sum of money," Nathaniel said, "and likely a considerable amount of frustration. I have only added numbers correctly, Your Grace. Any competent clerk could have done the same." "I have employed several competent clerks," Nathaniel said. "None of them noticed what you noticed in under an hour." Eleanor did not quite know how to respond to praise that sounded so entirely sincere, and so she said nothing, though a faint color rose in her cheeks that she hoped he had not noticed. He had noticed. He noticed a great many things about her that morning, and he found himself, over the following 2 weeks, inventing further reasons to call at Bramwell Hall. A question about drainage on a shared boundary, a concern about a tenant dispute that touched both estates, a polite inquiry about a charitable fund for the county's poor, which Eleanor, it turned out, managed almost entirely on her own, with little recognition and less thanks. Margaret Ashworth watched these visits with growing bewilderment, and eventually, growing suspicion. "He asks for Eleanor," she said to her husband one evening, after Nathaniel's 4th visit that fortnight. "Every time, it is some question that requires Eleanor's presence. Edmund, why does the Duke of Ravensworth require your elder daughter's opinion on drainage?" "I am sure it is nothing more than practical necessity," Edmund said, though he did not sound entirely convinced himself. "Eleanor has always had a talent for such things." "Practical necessity," Margaret repeated, with the tone of a woman rehearsing an argument she intended to win eventually. "Edmund, the man is unmarried, and every family in this county with an eligible daughter has been throwing dinners in his honor for a month. He does not need to consult Eleanor about drainage. He could hire an engineer. Perhaps he simply finds her good company. Eleanor is not meant for good company, Margaret said, and though she did not intend unkindness, the words landed with the particular weight that only a mother's careless honesty can carry. Camilla is meant for good company. Eleanor is meant to manage the household so that Camilla is free to be admired. That is how it has always worked in this family, and it has worked well enough. I do not intend to let some passing fancy of the Duke's disrupt an arrangement I have spent years securing. She resolved that same evening to intervene. Her intervention took the shape of increased vigilance. Whenever Nathaniel called, Margaret made certain Camilla was present, artfully positioned, freshly dressed, ready with some observation calculated to charm. She began finding reasons to send Eleanor away on errands during his visits, checking on tenant cottages, delivering baskets to the poor, tasks that kept her elder daughter usefully occupied and conveniently absent. It did not entirely work, because Nathaniel, once he had determined that Eleanor was elsewhere, would often find some reason to prolong his visit until her errands were complete, and would then, with careful casualness, ask after her welfare, or mention some detail from their previous conversation that only she would properly understand. "You seem quite invested in my daughter's opinions on drainage, Your Grace," Margaret said one afternoon, unable to fully disguise her irritation, as she poured tea in the drawing room while Camilla arranged herself decoratively by the window. "Perhaps Camilla might offer some perspective as well. She has a wonderful eye for beauty, even if drainage is not her particular strength." "I am sure Miss Camilla's talents lie in many directions," Nathaniel said politely, "though drainage may not be foremost among them." Camilla laughed prettily at this, taking it as the compliment it was not quite intended to be, and the conversation moved on to safer subjects: the weather, an upcoming assembly, a new bonnet Camilla had recently acquired from the milliner in town. Nathaniel participated with practiced ease, giving no outward sign of impatience, though inwardly he found himself counting the minutes until Eleanor might return from whatever task her mother had invented to keep her away. She returned that particular afternoon, just as he was preparing to leave, arriving through the garden door, with a now empty basket over her arm, and her cheeks pink from the walk. She stopped short upon finding him still present, glanced briefly at her mother's carefully neutral expression, and understood, with the quiet clarity of someone who has spent years reading the small signals of her own household, exactly what had been arranged in her absence. "Your Grace," she said simply, "I hope your visit has been pleasant." "It has been informative," Nathaniel said, "though I confess, I had hoped to ask your opinion on a matter before I departed, if you have a moment." Margaret's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly, but there was little she could do, in front of a duke, to refuse such a reasonable request without appearing rude. "Of course," she said, with strained graciousness, "though I am sure Eleanor is quite tired from her errands." "I am not tired, Mother," Eleanor said, and though her tone remained perfectly polite, there was a small, steady firmness beneath it that Nathaniel had come to recognize as entirely her own. They spoke for only a few minutes, standing near the garden door, while Margaret hovered close enough to overhear, but far enough to avoid outright rudeness. The matter Nathaniel raised was, in truth, a minor one, a question about a local charity fund, easily answered, but the conversation lingered longer than the question required, both of them finding small reasons to continue speaking past the point of necessity. It was in this conversation that Eleanor first allowed herself to consider, however briefly, that the Duke's attention toward her might not be entirely a matter of practical necessity. It was a dangerous thought, one she pushed away almost as soon as it formed, because dangerous thoughts, in her experience, led only to disappointment. She had watched her mother arrange Camilla's future for years. She had no illusions about her own role in that arrangement. And yet, when Nathaniel finally took his leave that afternoon, he paused at the door and said, quietly, so that only she could hear, "I hope our conversations might continue, Miss Ashworth. I find I learn a great deal from them." "I am glad to be of use, Your Grace," she said, though something in his tone suggested he meant a different kind of value than usefulness, and something in her own chest responded to that suggestion, with a warmth she did not entirely know how to name. He left, and Margaret rounded on her daughter the moment his carriage pulled away. "What did he want with you, precisely?" "A question about the charity fund, Mother. Nothing more." "See that it remains nothing more," Margaret said, though her voice carried more worry than command. Your sister has a real future ahead of her, Eleanor. If this family plays its part correctly, I will not have you complicating it, however unintentionally. Eleanor said nothing in response, because there was nothing safe to say, and she returned to her ledgers that evening with her mother's warning settled uncomfortably in her chest, alongside a second, quieter feeling she could not quite dismiss no matter how firmly she tried, the memory of a duke's voice, low and sincere, telling her that he learned a great deal from their conversations, and the unfamiliar, unwelcome hope that he might have meant more by it than he had said. By the middle of autumn, the county had settled into a comfortable certainty regarding the Duke of Ravensworth's intentions, and that certainty had Camilla Ashworth's name attached to it. She had been seen with him at 3 separate gatherings. She had danced with him twice at the Millbrook Assembly, an honor no other young woman had been granted even once. Letters from distant relations began arriving at Bramwell Hall inquiring, with poorly disguised eagerness, whether an announcement might be expected before winter. Margaret Ashworth answered these letters with careful modesty, the kind designed to seem humble while confirming every hope it pretended to deflect. She had, after her earlier worries, convinced herself that Nathaniel's peculiar attention toward Eleanor had been nothing more than a passing curiosity, the sort of mild interest a busy man develops in a capable clerk. Camilla, after all, was the one he danced with. Camilla was the one seated beside him at dinners. Whatever had passed between Nathaniel and Eleanor in quiet corridors and garden doorways, Margaret told herself, was surely nothing more than practical conversation, easily forgotten once a proper engagement was announced. Eleanor was not so certain, though she said nothing of her uncertainty to anyone. She had continued to see Nathaniel regularly, not at balls or dinners, where her mother made certain she remained safely in the background, but during the quieter, unremarked moments that made up the actual business of 2 neighboring estates. A shared boundary dispute between a tenant of Ashcombe and one of Bramwell required careful mediation, and it was Eleanor, not her father, who ultimately resolved it, walking the disputed field herself with both tenants and drawing a fair boundary line that satisfied everyone involved. Nathaniel had been present for that walk, ostensibly as the other estate's owner, though he had said very little and mostly watched, with an expression Eleanor could not quite read, as she worked. "You have a gift for this," he said afterward, as they walked back toward the road where their separate carriages waited. Most people, faced with 2 angry tenants and a disputed fence line, would have made the situation worse before making it better. "It is not a gift," Eleanor said. "It is only patience, and the willingness to listen to both sides before deciding which of them is more right." "That sounds very much like a gift to me," Nathaniel said. "I have known judges with less patience than you showed those 2 men today." Eleanor laughed despite herself, a small, surprised sound. "I do not believe I have ever been compared favorably to a judge before, Your Grace." Then the county has been remiss in its comparisons. They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the autumn air cool and bright around them, and Eleanor found herself, not for the first time, wishing the walk were longer than it was. She caught herself in the wish, and felt a small twist of guilt, remembering her mother's warning, remembering that whatever this was, whatever careful, quiet friendship had grown between herself and the Duke of Ravensworth, it existed in the shadow of an understanding the entire county had already reached regarding her sister. "May I ask you something direct, Miss Ashworth?" Nathaniel said, as they reached the road. "You may ask. I cannot promise a direct answer. Are you happy?" The question startled her more than she expected. It was not the sort of question anyone asked her, not her parents, who valued her usefulness above her happiness, and certainly not the county families who barely registered her presence at all. "That is not a question I am often asked, Your Grace. That is not an answer." Eleanor considered her words carefully before speaking, aware that something in this conversation had shifted into territory more honest than she typically allowed herself with anyone outside her own thoughts. "I have a role in my family, and I perform it well. I manage the household. I am useful. I do not know that happiness has ever been part of the arrangement, though I confess I have not thought to ask for it." "Perhaps you should," Nathaniel said, quietly enough that the words seemed meant only for her, though he offered nothing further, and their carriages arrived a moment later to carry them in opposite directions before either could say more. Eleanor thought of that conversation often in the days that followed, turning the question over in her mind at odd moments, while sorting linens, while reviewing accounts, while lying awake in her small room, listening to the wind move through the garden below her window. "Are you happy?" No one had ever asked her that before, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not entirely know the answer. She was not unhappy, precisely. She took genuine satisfaction in her work, in solving the small daily problems of a busy household, in the quiet competence she had built for herself over years of practice. But happiness, she was beginning to understand, might be something different from satisfaction, something she had never quite allowed herself to want, because wanting it had always seemed, in the arrangement of her family, like wanting something that belonged rightfully to her sister. Camilla, for her part, remained entirely unaware of the quiet current running beneath the surface of her family's arrangements. She had grown genuinely fond of Nathaniel's company. In the easy, uncomplicated way she grew fond of most pleasant things, and she had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to imagine a future as his duchess, a future filled with fine dresses and grand houses, and the kind of admiration she had spent her whole life receiving and had come to expect as her due. It was at the Millbrook Assembly, held on a cold evening in late October, that the quiet current beneath the surface finally rose close enough to be noticed. The assembly rooms were crowded that night, warm with candlelight and the noise of dancing, and Camilla had secured, as she had at the previous assembly, a place near the head of the dance line, where the Duke of Ravensworth would surely find her when the music began. She wore a new gown of pale blue silk, chosen carefully to match her eyes, and she had spent the better part of the afternoon ensuring her hair was arranged in the manner she knew was most flattering. Nathaniel arrived later than expected, delayed by some minor matter at Ashcombe, and by the time he entered the assembly rooms, the first two dances had already been claimed by other couples. He greeted his hosts, exchanged the necessary pleasantries with several families eager for his attention, and then, scanning the crowded room with the particular carefulness of a man looking for one face among many, found Eleanor. She was seated, as she usually was at such gatherings, along the edge of the room among the older women and unmarried aunts who did not dance, quietly watching the festivities with the same calm attentiveness she brought to everything else. She had not expected to dance that evening. She rarely did. Young men did not typically seek out the plain, practical daughter when her beautiful sister stood nearby, and Eleanor had long ago stopped feeling the sting of being overlooked at such events, or told herself firmly that she had. Nathaniel crossed the room directly toward her, and a small ripple of surprised whispers followed his path, because dukes did not typically cross crowded assembly rooms to speak with women who were not their intended partners. "Miss Ashworth," he said, bowing properly before her, "I wonder if you might do me the honor of the next dance." The room, Eleanor was quite certain, had gone entirely silent, though she suspected this was more a matter of her own perception than actual fact. She was aware of her mother's sharp intake of breath somewhere across the room, of Camilla's polite smile freezing very slightly at its edges, of a dozen curious eyes suddenly fixed upon her in a way they had never been fixed upon her before. "Your Grace," she managed, "I am not certain that would be appropriate." "Why not?" "Because," she said, lowering her voice, aware of the attention gathering around them, "the entire county expects you to dance with my sister, and I would not wish to cause talk." "The entire county," Nathaniel said, with a small, wry smile, "has expected a great many things of me these past weeks that I have not delivered. I find I do not much mind disappointing their expectations, provided the alternative is your company for the next quarter hour." It was, Eleanor understood, an impossible request to refuse, without creating precisely the kind of scene she had spent her whole life avoiding, and so, after a moment's hesitation, she rose, accepted his offered hand, and allowed herself, for the length of one dance, to be seen. They moved through the steps together, and though Eleanor was not an especially accomplished dancer, having had little occasion to practice, Nathaniel guided her with such quiet patience that she found herself, halfway through the dance, no longer thinking of the watching eyes around them at all, but only of the warmth of his hand at her waist, and the steady, careful attention in his gaze, an attention that felt, for the first time in her life, entirely her own, borrowed from no one, shared with no sister. Across the room, Camilla watched the dance with an expression that had begun, very slightly, to lose its practiced ease, and beside her, Margaret Ashworth's face had gone pale, with a dawning realization she had spent weeks refusing to entertain. The dance ended. Nathaniel bowed. Eleanor curtsied, her cheeks flushed with something that was not entirely embarrassment, and returned to her seat along the edge of the room, aware that everything had shifted, however slightly, and that the shift could not now be undone. The carriage ride home from the Millbrook Assembly was silent in the way that only a carriage full of unspoken things can be silent. Edmund Ashworth stared out the window at the passing dark fields, uncertain whether he ought to feel proud or alarmed. Camilla sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression composed, though the composure had cost her considerably more effort than usual. Margaret sat rigid and upright, her mind working through the evening's events with the swift, anxious calculation of a woman rearranging a plan that had suddenly developed an unwelcome crack down its center. Eleanor said nothing at all, and no one asked her to. It was only once they had returned to Bramwell Hall, once Camilla had retired to her room, and Edmund had wandered off toward his study, with the vague air of a man avoiding a conversation, that Margaret found Eleanor alone in the small sitting room off the kitchen, going through the household accounts by candlelight, as though the evening had been entirely ordinary. "You danced with him," Margaret said, without preamble. "He asked me. I did not think refusing a duke in the middle of a crowded assembly would have gone unnoticed either, Mother. Do not be clever with me, Eleanor. You know precisely what I mean." Margaret lowered herself into the chair across from her daughter, and for a moment, some of the anxious sharpness left her face, replaced by something closer to genuine bewilderment. "I do not understand what he wants with you. You have no fortune to speak of beyond what your father can offer, no particular beauty, no accomplishments beyond bookkeeping and household management. I do not say this to wound you. I say it because I truly do not understand." Eleanor set down her pen, and though her mother's words might once have cut deeply, she found, to her own quiet surprise, that they landed with less force than she expected. Perhaps because a duke had asked, only days earlier, whether she was happy, and no one in her own family had ever thought to ask her such a thing at all. "Perhaps," Eleanor said carefully, "he does not want a fortune or a particular beauty. Perhaps he wants someone who speaks honestly with him, rather than someone who has rehearsed every word before saying it." "That is a very charming notion for a young woman to believe about herself," Margaret said, though there was less venom in the words than there might once have been. "But charming notions do not secure a family's future, Eleanor. Camilla's marriage to a man of the Duke's standing would settle every debt your father carries. It would provide for your younger cousins, for your aunt's care in her old age, for the roof over all our heads. I have built every hope this family has around that possibility for 3 years. I cannot simply set it aside because the Duke found you amusing at one assembly. I did not ask him to find me amusing, Mother." "No," Margaret admitted. "I do not suppose you did." She was quiet for a moment, studying her elder daughter with an expression Eleanor could not quite place, somewhere between frustration and a reluctant, unfamiliar respect. "I will ask only this of you. Do not encourage him. Whatever passes between you when you are not watched, do not seek it out, and do not let it grow into something that cannot be easily set aside if it becomes necessary. Your sister's future matters more to this family than whatever pleasant conversation you have found with the Duke of Ravensworth." Eleanor did not promise anything, because she did not know, truthfully, whether she could keep such a promise, and she had learned long ago never to offer her word lightly. Margaret, perhaps sensing this, did not press further, and retired to her own room with the matter unresolved between them. Nathaniel, meanwhile, spent the days following the assembly in a state of quiet reckoning with his own feelings, a state made considerably more complicated by a letter that arrived from London 2 days after the Millbrook dance. The letter was from his aunt, Lady Beatrice Hartley, a formidable woman who had managed his late father's estate during his minority, and who considered herself, not entirely without justification, the guardian of his family's reputation. She had heard, through the swift and reliable channels that carried gossip between country and city, that her nephew had danced with the plain elder daughter of a modest county family, while the entire district expected an announcement regarding the beautiful younger one. Her letter was blunt in the manner Nathaniel had come to expect from her. "You have a duty to your title that does not permit indulgence in passing fancies," the letter read, in part. "Whatever charms this young woman may possess, you cannot allow a moment's whim to undo years of careful positioning. The Ashworth family's younger daughter is, by every account I have received, Precisely the sort of connection that would elevate your standing without complication. I urge you to consider your responsibilities before you consider your inclinations. Nathaniel read the letter twice, standing alone in his study at Ashcombe Manor, and felt something harden quietly in his chest, a familiar, weary resistance to being told, once again, that his life belonged to considerations of positioning and standing, rather than to anything he might genuinely want for himself. He thought of his own parents, whose marriage had been arranged along precisely such careful lines, a union of two great families that had produced, as far as Nathaniel had ever observed, very little genuine warmth between them. He thought of the years he had spent in London, attending balls where every conversation felt rehearsed, where every young woman's laughter seemed measured for effect, where he had begun to wonder whether he would ever meet anyone who spoke to him, simply because they had something honest to say, rather than because they hoped to secure his title. And he thought of Eleanor Ashworth, standing calm and unshaken in a darkened corridor, while chandeliers failed around her, kneeling beside a frightened housemaid, with no audience to witness her kindness, walking a disputed field with more patience than any judge he had known, asking him nothing, expecting nothing, offering only honesty in return for honesty. He folded his aunt's letter and set it aside, and did not answer it that day, or the next. Instead, he called at Bramwell Hall once more, ostensibly to discuss a matter concerning the charitable fund Eleanor managed, though both of them understood, by now, that these visits had become something considerably more personal than either would openly admit. Margaret, true to her earlier resolve, made certain Camilla was present for the visit, seated prominently in the drawing room, with a piece of embroidery she rarely touched with any real attention, ready to draw the Duke's focus the moment an opportunity presented itself. "Your Grace," Camilla said warmly, as he was shown into the room, "I have been hoping you might call again. I have just received the most delightful invitation to a house party at the Winterbourne estate, 3 counties over. I understand it will be quite grand, a full week of entertainments. I do hope you have received an invitation as well." "I have," Nathaniel said politely, "though I have not yet decided whether my duties at Ashcombe will permit me to attend." "Oh, but you must attend," Camilla said, with the easy confidence of a young woman entirely unaccustomed to disappointment. "Lady Winterbourne throws the finest gatherings in the county. It would be such a shame to miss it." Nathaniel murmured something non-committal, and the conversation drifted on through safe, pleasant subjects, the sort of conversation he had grown weary of over many months in London, comfortable and empty in equal measure. He found his attention drifting, more than once, toward the small writing desk near the window, where Eleanor sat quietly working through a stack of correspondence related to the charitable fund, ostensibly separate from the drawing-room conversation, but near enough that he could watch the careful, unhurried movement of her pen. "Miss Ashworth," he said finally, rising from his seat with a politeness that did not entirely disguise his purpose, "might I trouble you for a moment, regarding the fund's quarterly figures? I believe there was a discrepancy I meant to ask you about." There was, in fact, no discrepancy. Eleanor's figures were, as always, precise and correct, but she rose from her desk regardless, understanding the invitation for what it was, and led him toward the small adjoining study where the fund's records were kept, leaving Camilla and Margaret behind in a drawing room that had suddenly grown considerably quieter. "There is no discrepancy, is there?" Eleanor said, once the study door had closed behind them, though not so firmly as to seem improper. "No," Nathaniel admitted, "there is not." "Then why?" "Because I find myself, lately, inventing reasons to speak with you, Miss Ashworth, and I have grown tired of pretending otherwise, even to myself." He paused, choosing his next words with evident care. "I received a letter from my aunt this week, informing me, in no uncertain terms, that my duty lies elsewhere, that whatever I might feel toward you is a passing indulgence I cannot afford to entertain." Eleanor's chest tightened at these words, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "Your aunt is not wrong, Your Grace. The entire county expects you to marry my sister. I have no fortune, no particular standing, nothing to offer a man in your position beyond honest conversation, which is a poor foundation for a marriage that must satisfy so many other considerations." "Is honest conversation truly such a poor foundation?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "I have spent years surrounded by conversation that was never honest at all, Miss Ashworth. and I confess I have grown to value it above nearly everything else my position is meant to provide me." Eleanor did not answer immediately, aware of how much rested on whatever she said next, aware of her mother's careful arrangements waiting just beyond the study door, aware of her sister's future, her family's debts, the roles each of them had been assigned since childhood. "I think," she said finally, choosing her words with great care, "that we are both in a position where our feelings, whatever they may be, cannot easily be separated from what our families and our positions require of us. I would not want to be the reason you disappointed your aunt, or the reason my sister's future collapsed, however unintentionally. And if I told you," Nathaniel said, "that I would rather disappoint every expectation the county has built around me than spend my life married to someone I do not genuinely know?" "Then I would tell you," Eleanor said softly, "that such sentiments are easily spoken in a quiet study, and considerably harder to hold once the whole world has an opinion about them." It was, she knew even as she said it, both an honest warning and a quiet admission, and Nathaniel seemed to understand it as both, studying her for a long moment before finally nodding, as though accepting a challenge rather than a refusal. "Then I shall have to prove to you," he said, "that I mean to hold them regardless." He left shortly after, having asked nothing further about the fund's entirely correct figures, and Eleanor remained alone in the small study for several minutes before returning to the drawing room, aware that whatever quiet, careful thing had been growing between herself and the Duke of Ravensworth had just become considerably harder to deny, even to herself. Word of the dance at Millbrook spread through the county, with the particular speed reserved for gossip that threatens to overturn a settled arrangement. Within days, every household that had once considered Camilla Ashworth's engagement to the Duke a near certainty began to whisper a different possibility, one that seemed, to most observers, both improbable and faintly scandalous. A duke, choosing the plain elder sister over the acknowledged beauty of the county, was the sort of story that traveled quickly, precisely because it defied the natural order most people believed governed such matters. Camilla bore the whispers with outward grace, though the effort cost her more than she allowed anyone to see. She had never, in her entire life, been the subject of pity, and the sensation of it, however faint and however carefully concealed by the people around her, unsettled her in ways she found difficult to name. "It was only one dance. He will come to his senses. Everyone says so." "Everyone," Camilla repeated, with a faint, brittle smile, "has been saying a great many things lately, Charlotte, and I am no longer certain which of them are meant kindly." She did not raise the matter with Eleanor directly, not at first. The two sisters had never been close in the way some sisters were, not out of dislike, but out of the simple, quiet distance that grows between two people assigned entirely different roles within the same household from an early age. Camilla had spent her childhood being admired. Eleanor had spent hers being useful. Neither of them had ever had much occasion to resent the other, because neither had ever seriously imagined their paths might cross in any way that mattered. That certainty had now been disturbed, and Camilla found herself, for the first time in years, studying her elder sister with genuine curiosity, trying to understand what qualities she might possess that had captured a duke's attention so thoroughly that he was willing to risk the disapproval of his own family and the ridicule of an entire county. She found her answer, or thought she did, one afternoon in late October, when she came upon Eleanor in the garden, kneeling beside one of the tenant children who had cut her hand on a broken flower pot. Eleanor was cleaning the wound with quiet, practiced care, murmuring something reassuring to the crying child, entirely unaware that she was being watched. Camilla stood at the edge of the garden path for a long moment, observing the scene with an expression that shifted, slowly, from confusion to something closer to understanding. There was nothing remarkable about what her sister was doing. It was the sort of small, unglamorous kindness Eleanor performed every day, the sort no one ever thought to praise or even properly notice. And yet, watching it now, Camilla began to see, for the first time, what a duke, exhausted by years of performance and flattery, might find so quietly compelling in a woman who did such things without any expectation of an audience. It was not a comfortable realization, and Camilla did not entirely welcome it. "You are very good with her," Camilla said, once the child had been sent off, with her hand properly bandaged and a small sweet from Eleanor's pocket to ease her tears. Eleanor looked up, startled to find her sister standing there. I did not hear you approach. You rarely notice when anyone is watching, Camilla said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite an accusation, though it was not entirely free of one either. That must be rather restful, I imagine, not noticing. I am not certain what you mean. I mean, Camilla said, sitting down on the garden bench nearby with careful composure, that I have spent my whole life being watched, Eleanor, and being admired for being watched. And I confess, I had never once considered that there might be something appealing about the opposite. About simply being useful, and kind, and unremarked upon, until now, when I find a duke apparently prefers it to everything I have to offer. Eleanor sat down slowly beside her sister, uncertain how to respond to a conversation neither of them had ever quite had before. I have not sought his attention, Camilla. Whatever has happened, I did not plan it, and I would not have chosen to cause you any pain. I believe you, Camilla said, surprising herself with the honesty of the admission. That is, in truth, rather the worst part of it. If you had schemed for his attention, I could resent you properly. But you have done nothing at all, and he has still chosen you over every effort I have made, and I do not know what to do with that, Eleanor. I do not know what it means about me. There was a rare vulnerability in her sister's voice that Eleanor had never heard before, and it moved her more than she expected. It does not mean anything is wrong with you, Camilla. You are lovely and warm, and you have never been anything but kind to me, in your own way. Perhaps it only means that the Duke wants something different from what most men want. That is not a failing on your part. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, watching the last of the autumn light fade across the garden. Mother has built our entire future around the assumption that I would be the one to secure this family's position. I have never questioned that assumption, because it has always been true, in every other circumstance, for as long as I can remember. I do not know what happens to any of us if it stops being true now. I do not know either, Eleanor admitted quietly. I have thought of little else since the assembly. Do you love him? Camilla asked, the question arriving with unexpected directness. Eleanor considered lying, considered offering some careful, diplomatic answer that would smooth over the discomfort of the moment, and found, in the end, that she could not. I do not know yet. I know that he asks me questions no one else has ever thought to ask me. I know that when he looks at me, I do not feel as though he is comparing me to you, or measuring me against some standard I was always destined to fail. I have never felt that before, Camilla, not from anyone. Camilla absorbed this in silence, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a resignation that surprised them both. Then I suppose I have my answer, don't I? Whatever Mother hopes, whatever the county expects, I do not think this can be undone by wishing it were otherwise. She rose from the bench and walked back toward the house without another word, leaving Eleanor alone in the fading light, uncertain whether the conversation had settled anything or merely opened a wound that would take considerably longer to heal. That evening, at dinner, Margaret noticed a new tension between her daughters that had not existed before, a careful, watchful distance that made the usual family conversation feel strained and artificial. She said nothing of it directly, though she resolved, privately, to redouble her efforts before the situation slipped entirely beyond her control. Her opportunity arrived 3 days later, in the form of an invitation to a house party at Winterbourne Park, the very gathering Camilla had mentioned to Nathaniel weeks earlier. Lady Winterbourne's parties were famous throughout the county for their scale and grandeur, and Margaret saw in this invitation a final chance to arrange matters properly, away from the quiet, unremarked corridors and garden paths where her elder daughter seemed to have found such unexpected advantage. We shall all attend, Margaret announced at breakfast, a full week at Winterbourne Park. Lady Winterbourne has assured me the Duke is expected, along with a great many other eligible families. It will be an excellent opportunity for Camilla to be seen at her best, in surroundings suited to her particular gifts. Eleanor understood, without needing to be told directly, that she was expected to remain useful and invisible throughout the week, managing whatever small household matters arose, while her sister was given every opportunity to reclaim the ground she felt she had lost. She said nothing in protest, because there was, in truth, little to protest. It was, after all, exactly the role she had always been assigned, and she told herself, packing her modest trunk 2 days before their departure, that perhaps it would be for the best. Perhaps a week spent quietly in the background, a away from the Duke's unsettling attention, would allow her own confused feelings to settle back into their proper, familiar shape. She did not entirely believe this, even as she told it to herself, and as the family's carriage set off toward Winterbourne Park on a cold, bright morning in early November, Eleanor found herself watching the passing countryside with a mixture of dread and a hope she could not quite suppress, wondering what the week ahead might bring, and whether whatever existed between herself and the Duke of Ravensworth was strong enough to survive a full week of her mother's careful, determined arrangements. Winterbourne Park stood at the end of a long avenue of ancient oaks, its stone facade lit that evening by dozens of windows glowing warm against the November dusk. Lady Winterbourne had spared no expense in preparing for her guests, and the house party promised, as it always did, a full week of dinners, dances, hunting parties, and the sort of elaborate entertainments that gave the county's most prominent families reason to display themselves at their finest. Margaret Ashworth arrived with careful optimism, having spent the carriage journey outlining, in considerable detail, precisely how Camilla ought to conduct herself over the coming days. Camilla listened with the patient weariness of a young woman who had heard such instructions many times before, though something in her manner suggested she was performing patience rather than truly feeling it. Eleanor sat quietly beside the window, watching the passing countryside, and said very little the entire journey. They were shown to their rooms by early evening, and Margaret immediately set about ensuring Camilla's gown for that night's dinner was pressed and perfect, while Eleanor unpacked her own more modest trunk without assistance, as she always did, and prepared to make herself useful wherever the household required it. The first dinner passed largely as expected. Lord and Lady Winterbourne had seated their guests with careful attention to rank and reputation, and Camilla found herself once again placed near Nathaniel, who had arrived earlier that day from Ashcombe, and greeted the assembled company with the polished, distant courtesy Eleanor recognized from their earliest encounters, before she had come to know the more genuine warmth beneath it. Eleanor, by contrast, was seated far down the table, among a cluster of unmarried aunts and quiet gentlemen, who spoke mostly of crops and weather, and she passed the meal in comfortable, unremarkable conversation, aware, without needing to look, of exactly where Nathaniel sat, and precisely how often his attention drifted, briefly and carefully, toward her end of the table. It was on the second evening, during a card party held in the drawing room, that Margaret's careful arrangements began to show their first cracks. Nathaniel had been seated, by design, at a table with Camilla and two other prominent families, engaged in a game that required little genuine attention and considerable idle conversation. He played his hand competently, laughed at the appropriate moments, and offered Camilla the practiced compliments any well-mannered gentleman might offer his hostess's favored guest. But his attention, again and again, drifted toward the far corner of the room, where Eleanor had been quietly recruited by Lady Winterbourne's aging aunt to help organize a stack of correspondence that had grown unmanageable over the preceding weeks. "You seem distracted this evening, Your Grace," Camilla observed, with the easy lightness she had perfected over years of managing such conversations. "My apologies," Nathaniel said. "I confess my mind has wandered rather more than it ought." "Perhaps," Camilla said carefully, watching his face for any sign of confirmation, "toward matters of household management, rather than cards." Nathaniel's expression flickered, just slightly, and Camilla understood, in that small, unguarded moment, that whatever had passed between the Duke and her sister had not diminished in the days since the Millbrook Assembly. If anything, it seemed to have deepened, settling into something steadier and more difficult to dislodge than mere infatuation. She said nothing further on the subject that evening, but the following morning, she sought out her mother in the privacy of their shared dressing room and spoke with unusual bluntness. "It will not work, Mother," Camilla said, as her maid arranged her hair. "Whatever you hope to achieve this week, it will not work. He does not look at me the way he looks at Eleanor. I have watched him carefully these 2 days, and I no longer believe this is a passing fancy that will correct itself, given enough time and enough opportunities to admire me instead." Margaret's face tightened with the particular frustration of a woman watching a carefully built plan crumble before her eyes. "You must not give up so easily, Camilla. A week is a long time. There will be a hunting party tomorrow, and a grand ball on the final evening. Opportunities remain." "And if those opportunities produce the same result as everything before them?" Camilla asked. "What then, Mother?" Do we simply continue pretending the county's expectations will eventually bend reality to match them? Margaret had no easy answer for this, and the conversation ended in uneasy silence, though it did not stop her from pressing forward with her plans regardless. The hunting party, held the following morning across Winterbourne's extensive grounds, offered Margaret one final, carefully engineered opportunity. She arranged for Camilla to be positioned near the Duke throughout the morning's activities, ensuring their horses rode close together during the long stretches between the actual hunting, and ensuring that whenever the party paused to rest, Camilla was seated nearest to him with refreshments already prepared. It was during one such pause, as the hunting party rested beside a small stream cutting through Winterbourne's northern fields, that an unexpected accident disrupted Margaret's careful arrangements entirely. One of the younger guests, a boy of perhaps 10 who had been permitted to accompany his father on the outing, wandered too close to the stream's edge and slipped on the wet stones, falling into the cold, fast-moving water. The current, though not especially deep, was strong enough to sweep the boy several yards downstream before anyone fully registered what had happened, and his cries of alarm mixed with the sudden panicked shouting of the adults around him. Several gentlemen rushed toward the water's edge, though the steep, muddy bank made a quick rescue difficult, and precious seconds passed in confused, ineffective effort. It was Eleanor, dismounting quickly from her horse at the rear of the party, who moved first, with any real purpose, running along the bank ahead of the boy's drifting position, and wading directly into the cold water, without hesitation, catching him by the collar of his coat, just as he was about to be swept past a fallen log that might have pulled him under entirely. She dragged him, soaked and shivering but unharmed, back to the bank, where his frantic mother gathered him into her arms, weeping with relief, while the rest of the party stood momentarily stunned by how quickly and calmly Eleanor had acted, while everyone else had merely reacted. Nathaniel, who had been among the first to reach the water's edge, but had arrived a crucial moment too late to be of use, stood watching Eleanor emerge from the stream, soaked to the waist and entirely unconcerned with her own appearance, and felt something in his chest settle with a certainty he had been circling for weeks, but had not, until that exact moment, fully allowed himself to accept. "Are you hurt?" he asked, moving quickly to her side as she caught her breath. "Only cold," Eleanor said, managing a small, breathless smile despite her chattering teeth. "Someone should fetch him dry clothes before he catches a chill." "Someone should fetch you dry clothes as well," Nathaniel said, and without waiting for her protest, he removed his own riding coat and settled it over her shoulders, an act so immediate and unthinking that it drew the attention of the entire assembled party, including Margaret and Camilla, both of whom had arrived at the stream's edge just in time to witness it. Margaret's face, in that moment, lost whatever remaining hope she had carried into the week. There was no mistaking the expression on Nathaniel's face as he settled his coat around Eleanor's shoulders, no explaining it away as mere practical concern. It was the unguarded expression of a man who had, at some point in the preceding weeks, stopped merely admiring a woman's usefulness and started genuinely loving her. Camilla, watching the same scene, felt the last of her own quiet hope settle into something closer to acceptance, and though the moment stung, it stung less than she expected. She found herself, instead, admiring her sister's swift, fearless action, feeling something unfamiliar, and not entirely unwelcome, a genuine pride in Eleanor that had nothing to do with rivalry at all. The boy was carried back to Winterbourne Park wrapped in blankets, entirely unharmed, and Eleanor was ushered inside soon after to change out of her soaked clothing, the entire hunting party abuzz with the story of her quick thinking and Nathaniel's evident concern for her welfare. By the time the household gathered for dinner that evening, the story had spread through every corner of Winterbourne Park, and Margaret understood, with a resignation she had fought against for weeks, that whatever future she had carefully constructed for Camilla could not survive the events of that single cold morning by the stream. The story of the rescue traveled through Winterbourne Park's guest rooms and corridors faster than any servant could have carried it deliberately, gathering small embellishments with each retelling, until, by the time it reached the ears of the last arriving guests, Eleanor's brief, practical wade into a shallow stream had transformed into something considerably more dramatic. She found the exaggerations faintly embarrassing, and said as much to anyone who mentioned them, though she could do little to slow the story's spread. What mattered more, in the days that followed, was the quiet shift in how the household regarded her. Guests who had previously overlooked her entirely now sought her out at breakfast, curious to hear the story from her own lips. Lady Winterbourne herself, a woman famous for her exacting standards, made a point of thanking Eleanor personally, remarking that quick thinking of that kind was rarer than good breeding, and considerably more valuable in a crisis. Camilla noticed the shift as well, and though a smaller, more selfish part of her might once have resented the sudden attention paid to her sister, she found, to her genuine surprise, that she did not resent it now. She had spent the previous evening turning the stream incident over in her mind, watching Nathaniel's face as he settled his coat over Eleanor's shoulders, and had arrived, somewhere in the quiet hours before sleep, at a conclusion she had been resisting for weeks. She sought Eleanor out the following morning, finding her alone in the small library Lady Winterbourne had made available to her guests, and sat down across from her with an expression more open than any Eleanor had seen from her sister in years. "I have been unfair to you," Camilla said, without preamble. "Not deliberately, I think, but unfair regardless. I have spent my whole life assuming that being admired was the same thing as being valued, and I have never once considered what it might have cost you to be the sister who was simply useful, and never admired at all." Eleanor set down the book she had been reading, startled by the sudden honesty of the confession. "You have never treated me unkindly, Camilla. No, perhaps not unkindly, but I have never truly seen you either, not until this week, watching you pull that boy from the water without a moment's hesitation, while the rest of us stood frozen, wondering what to do. I have spent my whole life being told I was the remarkable one in this family, and I am only now beginning to understand how wrong that always was. You are remarkable in your own way," Eleanor said gently. "You have always been warm and generous with your time, even if Mother never taught either of us to value those things the way she valued beauty." Camilla considered this for a long moment. "Perhaps, though I confess I have spent this week learning that there is a difference between being admired and being loved, and I am not certain, until quite recently, that anyone has ever loved me the way the Duke looks at you." There was no bitterness in her voice as she said this, only a quiet, thoughtful acceptance that Eleanor had not expected, and it moved her more than any apology might have. "What will you do?" Eleanor asked. "I do not entirely know yet," Camilla admitted. "Mother will not give up easily, not after 3 years of building her hopes around this particular outcome. But I find, surprisingly, that I no longer wish to compete for something that was never truly mine to win. I would rather find my own path, whatever that turns out to mean, than spend my life resenting my own sister for something neither of us chose." It was, for both of them, an unfamiliar and somewhat tender moment, the first real honesty either sister had offered the other, in longer than either could easily remember, and though it did not erase years of quiet distance between them, it planted something new in its place, a fragile but genuine understanding that neither wished to lose. Margaret, however, remained considerably less willing to accept the shifting tide of events. She had watched, with mounting alarm, as the household's opinion turned steadily in Eleanor's favor over the days following the stream incident, and she resolved, with the stubborn determination of a woman who had built her entire sense of purpose around a single outcome, to make one final effort before the week's grand ball forced the matter to whatever conclusion it was heading toward. She approached Nathaniel directly on the penultimate evening of the house party, catching him alone in Winterbourne Park's long gallery as he studied a collection of family portraits with idle interest. "Your Grace," she said, with careful, measured politeness, "I wonder if I might speak with you plainly, if you will permit an anxious mother's honesty." "Of course, Mrs. Ashworth. I have observed your attention toward my elder daughter these past weeks," Margaret said, "and I do not doubt that Eleanor possesses genuine qualities worthy of admiration. She has always been the practical one in our family, capable, steady, reliable in ways I confess I have not always properly valued. But I would ask you to consider, honestly, whether such qualities alone are sufficient foundation for a marriage that must bear the weight of your position, your family's expectations, and the scrutiny of society at large. Camilla has been raised, from birth, to bear such scrutiny gracefully. Eleanor has not." Nathaniel considered her words carefully before responding. aware that Margaret's concern, however inconvenient to his own feelings, was not entirely without merit, or entirely without genuine maternal worry beneath its calculation. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Ashworth," he said. "And I do not doubt that your younger daughter possesses considerable grace, and would bear the scrutiny of society admirably, precisely as you say. But I have spent a great many years surrounded by people skilled at bearing scrutiny gracefully, and I have found, more often than not, that such grace conceals very little genuine substance beneath it. I do not say this to diminish Camilla, who has been nothing but kind in our acquaintance. I say it only to explain why I find myself drawn to a different quality entirely, one I have found, unexpectedly and entirely against my own careful plans, in your elder daughter." "And if I told you," Margaret said, her composure beginning to fray at its edges, "that choosing Eleanor would cost this family everything I have worked to secure, that Camilla's prospects would suffer immeasurably, watching her sister rise to a position she was always told would be her own." "Then I would tell you," Nathaniel said, with quiet but unmistakable firmness, "that I do not believe it is within my power, or yours, to arrange my heart according to whichever daughter's prospects seem most convenient to your family's plans. I have spent this past month learning what genuine regard feels like, Mrs. Ashworth, after years of its absence, and I do not intend to abandon it now for the sake of an arrangement I never agreed to in the first place." Margaret had no response to this that would not sound like begging, and she retreated from the gallery with as much dignity as she could gather, understanding, at last, that whatever hope she had carried into Winterbourne Park had been thoroughly and irreversibly dismantled by a week she had once believed would secure her family's future entirely according to her own design. The final ball of the house party approached with an unspoken tension settling over the entire household, every guest aware, by now, that something significant had shifted between the Duke of Ravensworth and the elder Ashworth daughter, and every guest curious to see how the matter would finally resolve itself beneath the bright chandeliers of Winterbourne Park's grand ballroom. The final ball at Winterbourne Park began, by every outward appearance, as a triumph of careful planning and considerable expense. Lady Winterbourne had spared nothing in its preparation, and the great ballroom glittered that evening with more candles than Eleanor had ever seen gathered in a single room, their light reflecting endlessly across polished floors and tall mirrors positioned along the walls to double the brilliance of the entire display. Eleanor wore a simple gown of deep green that Camilla had insisted, only that afternoon, she borrowed from her own considerable wardrobe. "You cannot attend the final ball looking as though you dressed for household accounts," Camilla had said, with the first genuine warmth she had shown her sister in years, adjusting the gown's fit with her own careful hands. "Let me do this much for you, at least." Eleanor had accepted, moved by the gesture more than she could easily express, and when she descended to the ballroom that evening, she caught, for the first time in longer than she could remember, an admiring glance or two directed her own way, unconnected to any Duke's attention at all. Nathaniel found her early in the evening, before the dancing properly began, and the two of them spoke quietly near the edge of the room, while the orchestra tuned their instruments, and the last guests arrived in a steady stream of silk and candlelight. "You look remarkable this evening," Nathaniel said. "Camilla insisted upon the gown," Eleanor said. "I confess, I feel rather like an impostor wearing it." "You are no impostor, Miss Ashworth. You have simply been permitted, for one evening, to be seen as clearly as you have always deserved to be seen." Whatever Eleanor might have said in response was interrupted by the orchestra striking its first notes, and Nathaniel, with a small, formal bow that nonetheless carried an unmistakable warmth, requested the honor of the opening dance. This time, there was no hesitation in her acceptance, no anxious glance toward her mother, no careful calculation of whether such a public gesture might cause talk. The talk, by this point, had already begun weeks earlier, and Eleanor found she no longer had the will, or the wish, to resist what had clearly become inevitable. They danced the opening set together, and though the room buzzed with quiet observation, no one dared comment openly on what every guest present understood to be a formal declaration in all but name. It was during the third dance of the evening, as the ballroom reached its fullest capacity, and the candles burned lower in their sconces, that disaster struck without any warning at all. A cluster of candles positioned too near a length of decorative silk draping along the ballroom's western wall caught fire suddenly, the flames climbing the fabric with alarming speed, before anyone nearby had fully registered what was happening. Within moments, a section of the drapery had become fully engulfed, casting sudden panic through the assembled guests as smoke began curling upward toward the elaborate plasterwork ceiling. The scene that followed mirrored, in its chaos, the blackout at Bramwell Hall weeks earlier, though considerably more dangerous. Guests screamed and scattered, several stumbling in their haste toward the ballroom's main doors, which quickly became clogged with too many bodies attempting to pass through too narrow a space at once. A woman near the fire fainted outright, and two gentlemen attempting to beat back the flames with their coats succeeded only in fanning them higher. Eleanor did not scream, and she did not run toward the crowded main doors. Instead, she moved immediately toward the smaller service entrance at the room's eastern end, the one she had noticed earlier that evening, while helping Lady Winterbourne's housekeeper manage some minor difficulty with the refreshment tables. An entrance most of the panicked guests, unfamiliar with the house's layout, had entirely forgotten in their fear. "This way," she called, her voice carrying clearly over the rising panic, steady, in a way that cut through the confusion around her. "The main doors are blocked. Follow me to the eastern entrance." Nathaniel, close beside her when the fire broke out, immediately began directing guests toward her voice, his own commanding presence lending authority to her instructions. Together, they guided perhaps 30 guests through the narrow service corridor and out into the cold night air, away from the smoke and the mounting danger, while household staff arrived with buckets and wet blankets to fight the flames directly. Margaret and Camilla, caught near the fire's origin when it first broke out, found themselves swept toward the crowded main doors, along with the majority of the panicked crowd, and it was only when the crush of bodies grew genuinely dangerous, several guests stumbling and nearly trampled in the narrow doorway, that Eleanor, having safely delivered her first group of guests outside, returned to the ballroom entrance to help manage the crowd still struggling to escape. She found Camilla near the edge of the crush, having become separated from her mother in the chaos, her earlier composure entirely abandoned in favor of genuine, unguarded fear. "Eleanor!" Camilla's voice carried real panic, the first Eleanor had ever heard from her sister, in any circumstance. "I cannot find Mother, and I do not know which way to go." "Take my hand," Eleanor said calmly, reaching through the crowd to grasp her sister's fingers firmly. "The service entrance is this way. Stay close to me, and do not let go." She guided Camilla through a gap in the crowd she had spotted moments earlier, leading her sister along the same narrow corridor she had already used to guide dozens of other guests to safety, and within a minute, both sisters emerged into the cold night air, coughing slightly from the smoke but entirely unharmed. Margaret was found shortly after, having been guided to safety through the main doors by one of Lady Winterbourne's footmen, and the family reunited outside on the frost-covered lawn, watching as staff and several of the male guests continued fighting the fire, which was finally brought under control before it could spread beyond the single section of drapery that had first caught flame. No one was seriously harmed, though the ballroom itself would require considerable repair, and the evening's grand ball ended considerably earlier and considerably less gracefully than Lady Winterbourne had planned. It was outside on that frost-covered lawn, in the confused, relieved aftermath of the crisis, that the evening's true turning point occurred, witnessed by nearly every guest who had gathered there to catch their breath and confirm their own safety and the safety of their companions. Nathaniel found Eleanor standing quietly at the edge of the gathered crowd, still holding her sister's hand, her green gown smudged faintly with smoke, her composure entirely intact despite everything that had just occurred. He crossed the frosted grass toward her without hesitation, and without any concern at all for who might be watching. "You saved a great many people tonight," he said, "myself and your sister among them." "I only knew where the second door was," Eleanor said. "Anyone might have done the same." "No," Nathaniel said, firmly enough that several nearby guests turned to listen. "Not anyone. I have watched you, these past weeks, do precisely this, again and again, quietly, without any expectation of thanks or recognition, while the rest of the world fixed its attention elsewhere. I do not believe I have ever met anyone so consistently, quietly good, in circumstances where no one was watching to reward it." Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon them now, Margaret's among them, Camilla's, Lady Winterbourne's, the entire assembled company of Winterbourne Park's grandest gathering, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever Nathaniel intended to say next would not be said quietly, or in some private corridor away from public view. "Miss Ashworth," Nathaniel said, and though his voice remained steady, something in it carried an unmistakable weight. "I have spent a great many years surrounded by people who valued me for my title, and performed kindness only where it might be observed and admired. I find I can no longer pretend that such performances hold any real value to me, not when I have witnessed, again and again, the genuine article, freely given, in you." The frosted lawn had gone entirely silent around them, every guest present understanding that they were witnessing something neither rehearsed nor arranged, something that had grown, slowly and honestly, out of weeks that had begun with nothing more than a single steady candle in a darkened corridor. The silence on the frosted lawn stretched long enough that Eleanor became acutely aware of her own heartbeat, of the cold air against her smoke-touched skin, of dozens of held breaths surrounding her, as the entire gathered company of Winterbourne Park waited to see what the Duke of Ravensworth intended to say next. "I do not wish to speak of duty tonight," Nathaniel continued, his voice steady, despite the audience surrounding them, "though I know a great many people, including members of my own family, believe duty ought to govern such decisions entirely. I have spent this past month watching you manage crises no one else noticed, comfort people no one else thought to comfort, and offer honesty in circumstances where flattery would have been considerably easier and considerably more expected. I did not come to this county seeking a wife, Miss Ashworth. I came seeking quiet and distance from a life that had begun to feel entirely hollow. I did not expect to find, instead, the one person who made that hollow feeling disappear entirely." Eleanor's throat had grown tight, and she was aware, distantly, of her mother standing nearby, with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between shock and a resignation that had finally, fully arrived. "I am asking you," Nathaniel said, "in front of everyone gathered here, because I find I no longer wish to hide whatever exists between us in quiet corridors and private studies. Will you consent to be my wife, Eleanor Ashworth? Not because your family requires it, and not because society expects it of either of us, but because I have never, in my entire life, wanted anything so genuinely and so completely as I want a future built beside you." Eleanor looked past him, briefly, toward Camilla, who stood a few feet away with an expression of quiet, genuine encouragement rather than any lingering resentment, and toward her mother, whose face had finally settled into something resembling acceptance, and toward her father, who looked simply astonished by the entire turn of events. She thought, in that suspended moment, of years spent managing linens and ledgers, years of being told she was good and useful and practical, and never once being told she was wanted for her own sake alone. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the frosted lawn. "Yes, I will." The gathered crowd erupted into a mixture of applause and astonished murmuring, and Nathaniel, without any regard for propriety or the watching eyes around them, took her hand and pressed a warm, grateful kiss against it, his relief and joy evident in every line of his face. News of the engagement spread through the county with even greater speed than the earlier gossip about the Millbrook dance had traveled, and within days, Bramwell Hall found itself besieged by callers eager to congratulate the family and, in many cases, to quietly reassess their previous assumptions about which Ashworth daughter had been destined for greatness. Margaret, to her credit, adjusted to the new reality with more grace than Eleanor had expected. Whatever disappointment she still carried regarding her original plans for Camilla, she found genuine comfort in the knowledge that her elder daughter's marriage would secure the family's future just as thoroughly. And in time, she began speaking of the engagement with something approaching real pride, even if that pride had arrived by an unexpected path. "I confess, I did not see this coming," she admitted to Eleanor one evening, as the two of them reviewed wedding preparations together, in the sitting room, where so many of Eleanor's quiet ledger work had once gone entirely unnoticed. "I spent years believing your sister's beauty was this family's greatest asset. I am only now beginning to understand that your steadiness was worth a great deal more, and I am sorry it took me so long to see it properly." "You saw what the world taught you to see, Mother," Eleanor said gently. "I do not hold it against you." Camilla's own path forward became clearer in the weeks following the engagement. freed at last from the weight of expectations she had carried, largely without complaint, for most of her life. She began, with her mother's more relaxed blessing, to spend time with a young clergyman from a neighboring parish, a quiet, thoughtful man named Edward Fairfax, who had shown a genuine interest in her company that had nothing whatsoever to do with securing a title or a fortune. Camilla found, to her own considerable surprise, that she preferred his honest, unremarkable attention to the grand admiration she had spent her whole life collecting, and by the time Eleanor's wedding preparations were fully underway, an understanding had quietly formed between Camilla and Edward that promised, in its own smaller way, the same genuine warmth Eleanor had found with Nathaniel. Lady Beatrice Hartley, Nathaniel's formidable aunt, arrived from London a month before the wedding, prepared, by all reports, to voice considerable objection to her nephew's choice. She met Eleanor over a carefully arranged tea at Ashcombe Manor, and though her manner remained initially cool and evaluating, she found herself, over the course of a single conversation, entirely disarmed by Eleanor's calm, unaffected honesty. "You do not attempt to impress me," Lady Beatrice observed, partway through their tea, with something between suspicion and grudging respect. "I do not know how to impress anyone, Lady Beatrice," Eleanor said simply. "I have only ever known how to be useful and honest, and I have found that those two qualities usually serve better than any performance I might attempt instead." Lady Beatrice studied her for a long moment, then set down her teacup with an air of final decision. "Well, my nephew has always had better instincts than I gave him credit for. I withdraw my earlier objections, Miss Ashworth, and I look forward to welcoming you properly into this family." The wedding itself was arranged for a bright morning in early spring, held in the small stone church nearest Bramwell Hall, attended by both families and a considerable portion of the county's population, all of them eager to witness the conclusion of a story that had captivated their attention for the better part of a season. Eleanor stood before the altar in a simple gown of pale ivory, chosen not for its grandeur but for its comfort, and as she looked across at Nathaniel waiting for her, steady and certain in a way he had been from their very first proper conversation, in a darkened servants' corridor, she felt none of the anxiety she had once expected to feel at such a moment. She felt, instead, a quiet, settled certainty, the same steadiness that had carried her through every crisis her family had ever faced, now finally turned toward her own future, rather than everyone else's. The first year of Eleanor's marriage passed in a manner she had never quite dared to imagine for herself, during the long, quiet years spent managing her family's household without any real hope of a different future. Ashcombe Manor, once neglected and half-crumbling under years of poor management, transformed steadily under her careful attention, its gardens restored, its tenant accounts finally set right, its east wing repaired well before the arrival of the following winter. She approached her new position not as a duchess performing grandeur for an admiring audience, but exactly as she had always approached everything else in her life, with quiet competence and genuine care for the people whose lives depended on her decisions. The county, which had once barely registered her existence beyond her role as her sister's plain elder companion, came to know her instead as a duchess unlike any they had previously encountered, one who visited tenant cottages personally, rather than sending stewards in her place, who remembered the names of servants' children, who managed charitable funds with the same careful precision she had once brought to her family's modest household ledgers. Where Camilla had once been admired for her beauty, Eleanor came to be genuinely respected for her substance, and in time, the distinction between the two sisters that had once seemed so vast and so fixed began to matter considerably less than either had ever expected. Camilla's own marriage to Edward Fairfax took place a year after Eleanor's, in a quieter ceremony, better suited to her new husband's modest parish, and though it lacked the grandeur of a duke's wedding, Camilla found in it a genuine contentment she had never quite located during her years of being admired for qualities that required no real effort on her part. She and Eleanor grew, over the following years, into a closeness neither had experienced during their childhood, meeting regularly, exchanging letters, offering each other the kind of honest support that had been entirely absent when each had been assigned her separate, isolated role within their family. Margaret Ashworth, watching both her daughters settle into marriages built on genuine affection, rather than careful arrangement, came gradually to understand a lesson she had spent most of her life resisting, that the qualities she had once dismissed as unremarkable in her elder daughter had, in fact, been the very qualities capable of building a lasting and genuine happiness, while the beauty she had spent years cultivating in her younger daughter had never, on its own, been sufficient to secure anything of real permanence. Nathaniel, for his part, found in his marriage exactly what he had hoped for during those long, weary months in London before his arrival in the county, a partner who valued him for reasons that had nothing to do with his title, and who offered him, in turn, the same steady honesty she had always offered everyone around her, whether or not anyone was watching to notice it. It was on a cold evening in their second winter together, during a violent storm that knocked out Ashcombe Manor's lighting entirely, plunging the great house into sudden darkness, that Nathaniel found himself remembering, with a fond and private smile, precisely how this entire story had begun. He found Eleanor in the main hallway, already moving toward the drawer where candles and matches had always been kept, striking a flame with the same calm, unhurried competence she had shown on the very first night he had ever truly noticed her. "Some things," he said, watching her light the candle, and turn to guide a pair of frightened young housemaids toward the safety of the servants' stairs, "never change." "Should they?" Eleanor asked, glancing back at him, with the small, private smile she reserved only for him. "No," Nathaniel said, crossing the darkened hallway to stand beside her, taking her free hand in his own, while the single candle's light flickered warm and steady between them, pushing back the darkness, exactly as it always had. "I would not change a single thing about you, not for anything the world might offer instead." Outside, the storm continued to rage against Ashcombe Manor's restored windows, but inside, in the quiet, candlelit hallway of the home Eleanor had once believed she would never truly belong to, there was only warmth and steadiness, and the particular, hard-won peace of a woman who had finally been seen, fully and completely, for exactly who she had always been. The county would tell this story for years afterward, embellishing it here and there, with each retelling. The tale of the plain elder sister, who had been overlooked her entire life, until a duke, weary of empty admiration, had looked past the beauty everyone else praised, and chosen instead the steady, quiet woman, who had simply held a candle when everyone else had panicked in the dark. But Eleanor herself remembered it more simply than the county's growing legend suggested. She remembered only that she had done what needed doing, as she always had, and that for the first time in her life, someone had finally noticed, and had never once stopped noticing since.